Assalamu alaikum, I'm Carl Arrindell and you're watching In Focus Election Special. Now, I'm delighted to be joined today by former London Mayor Ken Livingstone. Ken Livingstone was London's first elected mayor in 2000. Born and bred in London, he was a former leader of the Greater London Council between 1981 and 1986 and a Labour Party MP for Brent East between 1987 and 2001. Whilst his first term in office as London Mayor was somewhat controversially under an independent mandate, he represented Labour in the 2008 elections and is standing as the Labour Party candidate for Mayor in the elections on Thursday. Ken Livingstone, Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Islam Channel. Now, Islamophobia is a key issue that is of interest and concern to the Muslim community, and its growth Europe-wide has resulted, I think most would agree, in the most repressive of measures and government rhetoric against Muslims, asylum seekers, immigrants and their offspring. Prime ministers and even presidents have been ramping up their rhetoric in terms of the alien values of Muslims in their midst. The brutality of the Anders Breivik killings in Norway last summer seems not to have tempered that rhetoric in any way. It is a fact, isn't it, that London, the capital city of England, remains a hotbed of activities for the various far-right groups, some of which have been cited by Breivik as his inspiration. What should the Mayor of London be doing to tackle this problem? Should, in your opinion, such groups have been given sanction to march with their unsavoury messages into the heart of Muslim communities in order to stir up racial tension and disrupt community cohesion?
Well, there's nothing new in this. There's always been a tendency for right-wing papers and right-wing politicians to think they can get readers and voters by pandering to whatever the latest phobia is. I mean, back in 1906, the front page of the Daily Mail had a headline, "Jews bring crime and disease to Britain." And then it was the Irish and it was the black community. Currently it's Muslims. And the former Prime Minister of Norway, after David Cameron made his Munich speech, actually warned David Cameron that that language could fuel Islamophobia. And if you look at the popular media, it's depicted as though all the threat of terrorism comes from a handful of Muslim extremists. But the majority of potential terrorism in Europe comes from the far right. When the police discover 2 or 3 people in a far right group amassing guns and bomb-making equipment, it's 24 hours of news. When it's a Muslim group, it just stretches out over months and months and keeps coming back. And I think we've got to actually say this is harming our community cohesion. Muslims didn't come to London from Bangladesh or from Pakistan to bring Sharia law. They came to be part of the London community. They came to enjoy the tolerance that we actually have in this city. And therefore the Mayor's got to be actively promoting that, bringing faith communities together. If you go to the East London Mosque, it sits next to a synagogue that's been there most probably over 100 years. The synagogue and the mosque work together to campaign for a London living wage, to tackle the injustices and the poverty in the area. And I think that the strength of London is that for all that people whip up Islamophobia, most probably we are the most tolerant, well, I'm certain we're the most tolerant city anywhere in Europe. You look at France, the French Assembly has just unanimously voted to ban the hijab. Here, we aren't uncomfortable about people choosing to wear distinctive clothing. I mean, I once represented Stoke Newington, home of the Orthodox Jewish community. And if you look in London, some Jews have maintained their traditional culture, marry within a relatively small community. Others have become almost completely assimilated. I've had some London Jews say to me, "I don't understand what this thing's about Israel," But each Jew has made their own choice, and that's what we want to see for each of London's Muslims, that they should be allowed to live their life as they choose.
I want to move on to the issue of housing, which I know you have made as a core plank of your mandate as Mayor. You'll be aware that in many high Muslim populated areas, especially inner city boroughs such as Tower Hamlets or even Newham, the levels of poverty are amongst the worst in the whole country. There are many stories of families trapped on welfare dependency, people who are being forced to live in the most desperate of housing conditions with damp rooms and overcrowding. Housing benefit, tragically, upon which so many of those impoverished Muslim families are dependent, has been capped by this current government coalition, resulting in boroughs such as Newham recently, you must have read, being forced to relocate up to 500 families to the Midlands. Now, one Labour MP, a former housing minister, called this ethnic cleansing and accused the government of deliberately wanting Muslims out of the centre of London, saying that their policies were designed to drive ethnic minorities out of the city and to stop poor people from having children. Was she justified in her remarks, and what would you specifically do as head of, I think, the new housing building authority to protect the most vulnerable within the capital, in particular those in the Muslim community?
I don't think the government's policies are specifically targeted against Muslims. They're targeted against poorer people. And a bit like the great scandal 20 years ago when Lady Porter was moving working class families out of her borough, and eventually was fined £45 million for breaking the law, the gerrymandering. Now they're doing the same thing, and it's targeted at the poor. They think poor people vote Labour, rich people vote Tory, and largely wealth does determine your voting record, but there's an awful lot of quite poor people vote Conservative. If you look at America, a lot of the Republican vote comes from the very poorest white communities that have been seen their industry stripped out and feel sort of what Obama called clinging on to the Bible and to guns. And so there's nothing new about this. I mean, in Hammersmith and Fulham, they're trying to demolish well-run, good council estates because that will disperse Labour voters from marginal wards. And we've got to challenge this. I think the Mayor should be prepared to challenge this in court. No good housing should be demolished just to change the political complexion of a ward, as Hammersmith's doing. People shouldn't be told Croydon Council wants to send people to Hull. This will fracture neighbours, friends, family, and it will actually make the situation worse. What we should do is cap the rents, not the housing benefit. We used to have rent controls until Mrs. Thatcher abolished them in the late 1980s. We should actually make certain that we're actually controlling the rents and building new homes. The Mayor now has the power to be the house building authority for London. We've 1/3 families on waiting lists. We've got land to build 1/3 homes. Over the next decade, we could build those homes, not just solving the housing problem, but putting people back to work. I mean, 2/3 of all the jobs lost in London in the recession have been in construction. It's the collapse of construction has tipped Britain back into recession, into this double-dip recession. So all these things come together. Don't try and cleanse the poor out of the city. For a city to work, it needs a range of incomes. I mean, you just can't have a city in which there's only rich people voting Conservative. Where will their servants come from?
Now, one of the your sort of opposition candidates has made suggestion of a sort of London waiting rise in a cap. Is that something that you see as feasible?
I mean, you either have got to say, well, the housing benefit cap should be higher in London, or you've got to cap the rents. Actually, I'd rather cap the rents. You can go on increasing the housing benefit cap, money just pours into the pockets of rich landlords, and that's coming out of the taxpayer's pocket. Literally, nobody should have to pay more than 1/3 of their income in rent. And yet now in London, the average rent for a 2-bedroom private flat is 60% of the average wage. This is not sustainable. So you've got to build, but you've also got to control the abuses of these private landlords. And one of the worst is the lettings agencies. They do no more than introduce a desperate tenant to a landlord. They then take 10 or 11% of the rent, not just one-off, but as long as that tenancy is going. And this is, I mean, one of the reasons we'll set up a mayor's lettings agency where we can cut the cost of that to about 2 or 3%. And the National Landlords Association is working with us, thinks this is a very good idea. They have no interest in the bad landlords continuing. We should be driving them out of business.
Next, on to employment, jobs, or should I say unemployment and lack of jobs. I know that this is a big blank on your agenda. You will probably be aware that Muslim men are 4 or 5 times more likely to be unemployed than the average. And there is in some boroughs up in excess of 50% of Muslim men are unemployed and 75% of Muslim women unemployed. It's sometimes ironic that in boroughs like Tower Hamlets, which is the home of the finance centre of the country, the Canary Wharf, you've got some of the worst poverty in the country. It's particularly stark when you realise that boroughs like Newham, which is the home to the Olympics of 2012, suffers from some of the worst poverty and some of the greatest unemployment amongst those groups in particular. What should the Mayor be doing to, and what will you be doing to deal with those particular issues?
Part of the problem is that 30 years ago, Britain and America took a wrong turning. You had Thatcher and Reagan cutting taxes on the rich, deregulating the financial system. We were told this would lift the whole economy and wealth would trickle down to the poor. And it's been a catastrophic mistake. We've got to go back to making things somebody else wants to buy. I mean, it wasn't just the banks rose up. I mean, because of high interest rates, our manufacturing was basically wiped out. We need to actually have a better range of jobs in our city. I mean, half the people will never go to university. If you look at Germany, which has got this much better, unemployment's half the level there. I mean, they've kept their manufacturing, they made sure their banks invested in creating jobs in Germany. That was their top priority. Our banks were speculating in property and stocks and shares all over the world. So we've got to rebalance our economy so it's more mixed, not so dependent on the financial sector. I think also my successor, the Tory Mayor, closed our offices in China and India, which were attracting inward investment. Now, there'll be no great growth in the European economy with the problems of the Eurozone. The real growth in the world economy is coming out of those areas. We should be saying to the businesses there, come and invest in London. We have a most dynamic workforce. We've also got a most tolerant city. Then I think there's a final issue in this, which is discrimination. Within the public sector, there is nothing like that level of discrimination against Muslims. Still in many private firms, there is clearly rampant discrimination, which is the only way you can explain this inequality in terms of the levels of unemployment. And both the Mayor and the government have got to tackle that, or you will end up with a disaffected and angry community of young men.